Hi everyone, good to see so many of you here. My name is Manny. I had the pleasure of presenting to some of you at last year's SAN Summit when I was talking about deepfakes. I work as lead analyst and manager on the dark web reconnaissance team, which is a small specialized unit within the wider Accenture cyber intelligence practice. And as the name suggests, our main function is to go on the deep dark web criminal underground, where we act as an early warning system for clients by reporting on threats and trends, essentially trying to figure out who's targeting who, with what tools, and leveraging which kinds of capabilities. Now, what I want to talk to you about today is an amalgamation of research done by myself and the wider research team, specifically looking at how advanced persistent teenagers, or APTeens, pose a risk to your organization and why they're able to have such an outsized impact on your career. For those of you who had the pleasure of joining the previous presentation from Rebecca, there will be a little bit of overlap here, and you will hopefully see that this is a nice extension of that. Now, needless to say, APTeens is an area that's received significant media attention throughout 2025, but I think, unfortunately, especially sort of in the more mainstream media, a lot of this has been quite clickbaity, right? It always makes for a good story that a teenager in a basement can bring down a big company, but in that clickbaitiness, you lose a bit of analysis and insight, which is what I hope to rectify today. Now, needless to say, there's been a ton of APTeen activity throughout 2025, really kicking off with Scattered Spider against UK retailers in April, followed by targeting of aviation, followed by targeting of insurance and French fashion houses, and of course, currently we have an ongoing event against Salesforce and Salesforce integration by Shiny Hunters and Scattered Lapsus Hunter. Now, I'm not one of those people who subscribe to the idea that these guys choose an industry, target it to exhaustion, and then move on to the next one. But what I'll show you a little bit later is that they have a really eclectic set of motivation that lends itself to targeting certain industries that favor disruption and media attention over sort of quiet exfiltration. Now, it is quite easy to think that these teenagers take the back seat of defense when we think about other things like real APTs. But unfortunately, what we have seen, we've been tracking what is now considered APTeens since 2016. And what we've now seen is that, especially in 23, 24, and 25, some of the most costly and disruptive cyber attacks that's been happening has been perpetrated by sort of APTeen-related threat actors, right? Jaguar Land Rover has been classified as the single costliest single company event in the UK, and obviously, I know they don't say it's a government bailout, but it's pretty close to being that. We've seen that Marks & Spencer's reported a 99.9% drop in profits following their event. We've seen that MGM Grand and Caesars reported $3-digit million-dollar losses from their events, and the list goes on. What we have seen is we've seen a reversal of this idea that breaches are getting cheaper as defenses gets cheaper and more widespread. And this is not only because of these APTeens, but the costliness and the disruptiveness of their attacks have really been driving up this cost associated with data breaches. So with that said, let's take a look at APTeens, how they operate, and what they are. Now, as the name suggests, an advanced persistent teenager, or an APTeen, is a threat actor that's emerging during their teenage years and do the bulk of their activity during their teenage years. As Rebecca was alluding to earlier, almost all of the APTeens that we've identified in Accenture, and we've identified a lot at this point, and almost all of the ones identified by law enforcement, tends to follow the same kind of mold. Right? They're young juvenile boys, predominantly residing in the UK, US, and Canada, but increasingly also in France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and some of the Nordic countries, who start hacking in online gaming circles and then rapidly progress through the cybercrime ecosystem to become, some of them at least, SIM swappers and initial access brokers partnering with Russian language cybercrime groups. Right, the two gentlemen you see on the screen is very indicative of this trend. This is Noah Michael Urban and Tyler Buchanan, who was identified and arrested as members of Scattered Spider. As Rebecca showed you earlier, we have Kai Logan West, who was identified and arrested as a leading member of the Intel Broker collective. And of course, we recently found the identity of Tala Jubair, who was a core feature in Lapsus, Scattered Spider, and potentially also Scattered Lapsus Hunter before his arrest. And Tala Jubair is quite interesting because he started hacking around 13, 14 years old. He was arrested shortly after his 18th birthday. So that gives him a 4-year period. In that 4-year period, he made $115 million. That's what he had access to on his crypto wallet, not sort of the wider Scattered Spider groups and the com groups. And we think he did this primarily investing in dark web tools and services and infostealer credentials somewhere to the tune of between $7,000 to $15,000 US. So that gives him, over a 4-year period, a return of investment of 3 million%, which is better than winning the Powerball if you only play once and win the jackpot. And what this shows us is a couple of things, right? It goes to show us how effective their attacks is. It also shows us that there is a ton of victims that's not reported, and those victims actually pay out a ton of ransoms. Now, the interesting thing is not who these guys are, right? It makes for a good story to show you who they are, but it doesn't really change anything, right? It's like the head of the Hydra that just keeps popping back, because every time we identify and arrest one of them, there's 3 or 4 new ones waiting to take their place with new ideas. So the only thing we really can do at scale is figure out how they operate and therefore how we can tailor our mitigations against them. So let's take a look at APTeen activity, and starting by how they gain initial access. Right, I wouldn't be able to talk to you about APTeens without at least mentioning Scattered Spider. I assume most of you in here knows most of what there is to know about Scattered Spider, so I'm not going to go into any great detail. But they are the most notorious, infamous, and active of all the APTeen groups, and we can use them as an example to see how they do activity. Right, what makes Scattered Spider interesting is not how they behave inside of your networks. Right? Once they're inside of network parameters, they behave like most other groups we're tracking in terms of persistence, lateral movement, and data exfiltration. What makes Scattered Spider and other APTeen groups unique is how they behave after an attack, so in the monetization phase, which we'll talk more about later, but also how they get in the first place. 99% of all APTeen activity that I've been reporting on and working on, both as an incident response and also as CTI, is based on voice-based social engineering, especially sort of since 2023, right? And this is really important because voice-based social engineering is the foundation of everything that these guys are doing, and they're great at doing voice-based social engineering, or vishing, because they are the only threat actor we're tracking that are domestic-based, targeting domestic entities, right? No Russian cybercrime group would ever target Russia. That's a foundational rule of Russian cybercrime. Typically, no hacktivist or APT group would ever target domestic infrastructure. So the fact that these guys are targeting domestic entities while being based in those countries give them a unique advantage, because they speak local language, they understand local culture, right? And this is really important because this makes these guys extremely valuable to partner with for all of these Russian language ransomware as a service groups that you can see on the screen. Right? This is why we've seen Scattered Spider and other APTeens baked into all of these otherwise pretty difficult to get to groups, because the reality is that if you want to target a Western company at the moment, the easiest way to do so is crafty social engineering, and there's no one better that can enable you to do that than some of these APTeens. Now, this is important because threat actors of all skill levels on the dark web say that social engineering is vital for their operation. Right? Preliminary analysis we've done show that 59% say that social engineering is vital for their operations, and 28% says it's really important. As you can see from those bottom screenshots, even threat actors that have technical attack methodologies, exploits, different kind of Trojans and so on, are increasingly dependent on social engineering as a way to either deliver that exploit or to bypass MFA. Therefore, social engineering is an area that these guys are investing a lot in, and Scattered Spider are the best ones, or APTeens are the best ones at doing it, that are also willing to do it against domestic entities. But these APTeens are not only good at doing social engineering because they understand local culture and speak local language, right? They're also really smart in how they use key dark web tools and services to enrich and augment their social engineering capabilities. And since 2024, 2023, these are the 4 main ways we see these guys are leveraging the dark web as a way to enhance their capabilities. Right, the use of infostealer credentials to deliver a social engineering ploy from inside of network parameters, the use of emergency data requests to obtain sensitive information that can feed into secondary ploys, the weaponization of leaked enterprise data, and of course, OSINT research ahead of their victim. Right, and I want to just give you a couple of examples of what this looks like in real life. Not so long ago, I was working on a case perpetrated actually by Tyler Jubair, who I showed you earlier. And he had gone on Russian market, purchased a set of credentials, giving access to a Teams account belonging to a trusted third party of the primary victim. He then used that Teams account to contact the primary victim, saying that he'd recently been onboarded a role on a project and therefore needed access to some new folders and some additional privileges. Right, that failed 4 times, but on the 5th attempt it worked over the weekend, and then from there he proliferated into the wider network and initiated a data extortion event. Right, this is an extremely simple attack to pull off. I think colloquially we say they don't hack their way in, they just ask their way in. But unfortunately, it is extremely prolific. Most of the large-scale attacks you can think about that has some sort of dark web component to it has been perpetrated exactly through this kind of attack methodology, because it's extremely effective and it's very, very cheap to pull off for a threat actor. Now, of course, enterprises are getting better at defending against these kind of attacks, and MFA is becoming more widespread, which is good. But these threat actors have just started to pivot instead, right? So what we've increasingly seen them do is that they will do an obscene amount of OSINT research on their victims using public data and sort of non-public data, and then use that to enrich their ability to do the social engineering ploy that resets MFA. A recent case I worked on, we had an APTeen working with Blockbuster who purchased a set of credentials giving access to the corporate Teams account that was protected by MFA. They then, before they called the help desk asking for a reset, they had gone on his family's Facebook page and Instagram and all the other social media accounts, figured out that they were on holiday, where they were on holiday, that they were cutting their holiday short one day to take ownership of a new dog, and that they had some issues with a rental car company. They'd also seen on his LinkedIn that he was going to take responsibility of a new merger and acquisition the company had recently gotten, and he was going to sort of rise the ranks a little bit. From previous enterprise leaks, both from the company itself, but also from third parties, they could see some of the internal jargon, they had some projects they could refer to, and of course, the guy himself had multiple password breaches, which none of them was his current password, but it gave them a pretty good idea of what a structure may look like. So all of this meant that when they were ready to pull the trigger on this attack, they called the help desk and they could very accurately portray this person, so much so that even though they actually couldn't answer the answers to the questions, they could still reset MFA and then from there proliferate into the wider network. Two things are consistent across these two examples I've given you and across, I'd say, 80–90% of all APTeen activity that I've been working on. Infostealer credentials and social engineering, right? The problem with infostealer credentials is that they are nearly always present. Like everyone else, we look at these credentials whenever we do a threat assessment, and what we've found is that 67% of companies have direct moderate exposure and 7% have direct critical exposure. But when you begin to factor in the accounts from third parties and sort of the wider supply chain that could pose a risk, that number nearly always rises to 90–95%, meaning that these infostealer credentials are always present. Now, the problem is that only 12% of all infostealer infections we've ever encountered are actually from a corporate device, right? 88% are found on private devices, meaning that the enterprise has no way of monitoring for these. And when we first told this to C-suite, they thought that this was a good thing, right? They thought this meant that there's no threat. But obviously, with session tokens, with cookies, and of course with crafty social engineering, these privately exfiltrated infostealer credentials can still very much pose a risk to a corporate setting. But what this means is that there's a pretty big blind spot that enterprises can't really see unless they're actively looking for these. And this is a blind spot that these teenagers are very good at weaponizing at scale and at speed. Let's see here. Okay, there's a formatting issue here, but that's all right. Just to give you an idea of what this looks like, these are from the chat. The username Amtrak was the name that Tala Jubair was using. And you can see here that his favorite methodology at the time when he was part of Lapsus was to purchase or get access to T-Mobile and then use that access directly to SIM swap companies as a way to get direct access or pivot from some sort of other account like Slack or Teams. And I think the sad thing, the interesting thing is that sometimes these credentials can be really old, right? As you can see on the right-hand side, he purchased a set of credentials that was 5 years old, so it had been scraped 5 years prior, and yet it still gave direct access into that company's Jira session because there was no due date on those session tokens. And this just goes to show how effective these can be. Now, the other constant across these attacks is the use of crafty social engineering. And currently, there are two main workflows that these teens are operating. Right? ScatterSpider prefers the bottom-up approach where they get credentials mimicking an employee, use that to contact the internal help desk, and then from a position of needing assistance, ask for some sort of access, and then use that as a way to gain further access. That's ScatterSpider's sort of current attack methodology. Shiny Hunters, Scattered Lapsus Hunter, targeting Salesforce at the moment, is preferring the top-down approach where they get credentials or spoof credentials from internal or external IT, and then use that as a way to contact the employee, and then from a position of authority, tells that employee that they're uncompliant or they failed to install something, and then use that as a way to get access. right? Both of these workflows are being weaponized, and it's something you should think about when you do awareness training, phishing simulation, and so on. Now, we've increasingly encountered in our incident response that there is a use of a female voice when it comes to the voice-based social engineering attack, right? Some of these have been a real woman. We know this because it sounds very, very real, and also NCA recently arrested a young woman as part of Scattered Spider. But some of these have been deepfake, vocal deepfakes for those of you who attended my presentation last year. And we think that these guys are doing it for two main reasons, right? Obviously, for OPSEC, they know they get recorded, so not having your own voice right then and there is a good thing when law enforcement comes knocking a few years later. But also, we know that they're leaning into this idea of gender and psychology, right? Because people are less likely to be skeptical if a young woman calls and asks for tech help. They don't perceive it as being a malicious event, and these guys are weaponizing it because it gives them a higher chance of success. Again, this is something to be aware of when you're thinking awareness training and phishing simulation. Now, one interesting thing we've seen really taking off in the beginning of 2025 up until this point has been that they've increasingly started to leverage malicious insiders as a way to get initial access. And it's very easy to dismiss this very public malicious insider recruitment campaign from these guys as just another way to get attention. But in the last 2 months, I've worked on 8 malicious insider cases that these guys have recruited Scattered Lapsus Hunter alone, and it goes to show that they are capable of cultivating and recruiting insiders. Now, the research isn't completely finished, but to cut a long story short, we've never seen a higher threat posed by malicious insiders on the dark web than we currently do. And I think it's a perfect storm of factors that's driving this, right? So there's mass industry layoffs across white-collar industries, and this creates a large pool of people that could become malicious insiders. There's also obviously cuts due to AI, and psychology shows that if you get replaced and fired, and you get replaced with an AI, then you're inherently more angry than if you, quote-unquote, just got fired. On top of this, there's a cost of living crisis, so people can't really afford to stay unemployed for as long. And these guys know this, they weaponize this, they're actively recruiting, meaning that malicious insiders is currently one of the key ways these guys are getting access, evident by the CrowdStrike event we saw a few weeks ago, but it's something that's happening. It's something we see a lot of in our incident response data, and it's something you should take seriously now. All right, that's how they get in. Let's take a look and see what they do after an attack has already happened. So they've gotten into your network, and now we are in the monetization phase of an event, right? The old risk assessment framework will tell us that risk equals likelihood plus impact, and that is true, but when it comes to these teenagers, we need to flesh that out a little bit more. As I've hopefully just shown you, their capability of getting into enterprise network is pretty good, but they also have a really eclectic mix of motivation that leads to unpredictable behavior, therefore a higher impact and an overall higher risk. Now, we've been tracking these teens, as I said, since 2016, and I can conclusively tell you that the current version of these AP teenagers is the most disruptive and worst version that we've seen, specifically because they've gotten better at getting access, infrastealer credentials, social engineering, but also because they favor disruption and notoriety more than a quiet attack that may yield a higher payment. To cut a lot of research down into just the 4 bullets, it's hard, but the main motivators we see that these guys are displaying is, of course, financial gain. That's why Tyler Gibraltar was able to make $115 million, but also a very, very strong focus on notoriety and clout and internal rivalries as their driving force. And here it's all about who had the biggest breach, who has the latest naming convention after them, who's done the most media cycle, who caused the most disruption or cost the most money for the company. And we know from research that if you have notoriety or clout as a driving motivator, you are inherently much more unpredictable as an adversary. And this is a problem because a lot of victims tend to treat these guys as if they are a financially motivated linear Russian cybercrime group. And that's a mistake, because we've seen them many times being offered a payment and then still dump data and just foregoing the payment. And we know that if you have notoriety as one of your main motivators, it truncates event timelines, it makes a data leak more likely, and it makes for a very public event as opposed to sort of a more quiet data breach. Now, one of the final motivators we've seen that these guys are displaying is a motivation of personal revenge. And they're the only type of threat actor we've seen that consistently and persistently shows personal revenge as a driving force. And they're really good at using sort of a few key tools to do this, right? They are very good at doing lawsuit seeding against you as an individual, but also against you as an enterprise. And they're good at weaponizing media for personal targeting. And here, it's all about, for these guys, to create this tacit idea that the C-suite is somehow complicit in the data breach or the ransomware event, either from being negligent in the first place or failing to contain it during a negotiation. And they hope to create a long-lasting rift between the executives, the employees, and the customers, which will have a lasting impact on either first responders, on legal counsel, or on the executives overall. So if you look at that bottom screenshot, the black one, that was from a threat actor called Golem, who targeted 23andMe, the genetic database company, I think a year and a half ago. And when the company refused to pay a fairly modest payment of $100,000, Golem essentially burned his own TTPs by showing exactly how he got in, which was very easy stuff. And he also disclosed the entire negotiations he'd had with the C-suite. And long story short, this was a really detrimental event for 23andMe, right? 23andMe, 7 out of 8 board members resigned. The company paid a $30 million class action lawsuit, and the CEO of the company at the time was being considered for a criminal negligence case. And this just goes to show that they can have a real impact on you as an individual. And this is not an accident. They do this by design as a way to discourage future payers from not paying or to punish you if they feel like you haven't done what you should. We can see this again, of course, with Qantas recently. Qantas released their sustainability report and their earnings report, which showed that they did really well. All of the employees get a one-time bonus of $1,000, except the upper management. The CEO was docked $250,000 in cash bonus, and the wider board was docked an additional $250,000, all because of a Scattered Lapsus Hunter ransomware attack that happened earlier this year, or data breach event, I think. And you could argue that $500,000 between 5 executives is not a lot of money, but it does go to show you that they're increasingly able to have an impact on you as an individual, not just an enterprise. We've seen them SIM swap officers of the forces that have been arresting their mates. We've seen them out and name negotiators who's negotiating the ransomware payment. We've seen them specifically partner with Killin and other sort of ransomware groups that focus on regulatory extortion as a way to use regulatory frameworks to extort victims, right? Based on your industry and where you're operating, you will have different regulatory frameworks that apply to you. They will have legal staff on hand who knows when you've been in violation of one of those frameworks and use that as a lever against you. We've seen them crowdsource harassment against mid-level managers from a recent Salesforce campaign where they essentially pay any participating threat actor if they call, physically harass, or email a mid-level manager. And this is a manager who may not even be aware that an event is ongoing, and now this guy is suddenly receiving 800 emails saying they're gonna break his knees. We've seen them threaten employees to report their own company to the SEC if they're being non-compliant. We've seen them threat physical violence. We've seen them release data packages suggesting that the executives had an inappropriate sexual relationship with a junior employee. And we've seen them leak data suggesting that the executives are somehow cooking the books or being sort of financially irresponsible. And the thing is, if you've done nothing wrong, they will still find a way to do it. Increasingly, we've seen these guys are leveraging very basic AI tools as a way to drive this kind of attack methodology further. Just to give you a recent example of this came from Scattered Lapsus Hunter, who had what was a genuine access to a large European pharmaceutical company. They had gotten this access from a malicious insider, we know because we worked on the case, and we very quickly was able to sort of revoke that access, and there was no event happened. It was completely fine, no data was exfiltrated. However, a few days later, they started uploading this dashboard image, suggesting they still had access to the dashboard of the administrator. And when you first look at it, it looks fairly okay, right? But then you realize this panel out here is weird, the formatting is all weird, these usernames are extremely generic, and of course this panel in the middle doesn't really make any sense. And the longer you look at it, the more you realize it's just an AI-generated image designed to make it appear as if they still have access to company networks. We saw the same thing against Turkish Airlines, where they uploaded what they claimed was an admin dashboard proving access to the company. But then you wonder, why does a network admin have a live revenue counter on their screen? And why do none of these flights match the real flights? And this poses zero technical risk to your organization, right? But organizations still have to go out and dedicate resources to confirming to stakeholders that nothing has happened. And when this becomes a problem at scale, it becomes a really difficult thing to deal with. Now, we've done a lot of analysis into the sentiments of what it's like to be the victim of different kinds of threat groups, right? There's a different public opinion around you as a company or you as an executive, depending on who has been targeting you. And what we've come to find is that if you get targeted by a real APT group, you typically get sentiments of sympathy. Right? The idea is that if Russia or China wants to hack you and they use a fancy zero-day exploit, there's nothing you could do about it, and it's just how it is. But if you get breached, if you have a large event, if you have disruption, if you have data leak because of a teenager who used InfoStealer credentials and you hadn't even put MFA on your account, now you get sentiments of sympathy, of individual blame, and it's really all about scapegoating. Right? This becomes really clear in reporting cycles, but also in general media headlines. And I know for sure that purely from a public relations perspective, if I was to be targeted by only one group, I would choose an APT any day over an APteen. Now, these guys know it, right? They know that they cause bad press, and that's why they have a specific strategy of weaponizing media against their victims. I've talked to these guys many times using a moniker where they think I'm a journalist, and they love talking to journalists, right? That's why we always see them talk to Joe Tidy from the BBC, talk to TechCrunch, talk to Bleeping Computer, and all these kind of other things. And you can think of that what you want, but they know how to play the media, they know how to leverage these media cycles to have an outsized impact on their victims. We saw this play out recently, right? The problem is that most victims overlook this. If you don't do anything, most victims only focus on incident response, and of course incident response is the most important thing when it comes to dealing with cyber incidents, but you also have to fight them from a public relations media perspective. If you don't do anything, the teenagers will dominate the media cycle. If you go out and you say something wrong, they will immediately punish you for it. We saw this recently with Co-op, who was targeted as part of the Scatter Spider Dragon Force campaign. And Co-op, I think after 12 hours or something like that, went out and said, don't worry, no customer data was taken, which was really fast. 8 hours after that happened, the threat actors sent a big data trove to the BBC, proving they'd taken something like 25 million customers' personal data. Then Co-op had to go out and rescind their statement, and this is pretty bad press, right? At best case scenario, Co-op looks incompetent. Worst case scenario, Co-op looks negligent or like they're trying to be facetious. And this is by design by these teenagers. And therefore, understanding what's been taken, what's not been taken, what's been compromised, what's not been compromised becomes very important to communicate very effectively outside of just the traditional incident response. Now, I know I've told you that these guys aren't financially motivated, but when it comes to tracking threat actors internally, we just use 3 buckets: financial, espionage, and hacktivist. And unfortunately, it is in the financial motivation bucket that we put these guys into. Now, what this means is that we currently have a situation where, barring a few key industries like law enforcement, insurance, government, defense, telco, and critical national infrastructure, you are overwhelmingly much more likely to be targeted by an APteen during the course of your lifetime, right? Hacktivists rarely pose a threat anymore. I can't remember the last time a real hacktivist attack had any meaningful impact on an organization. APTs, of course, is the worst thing that can happen to an organization if it happens, but we currently have a situation where APTeens are the most likely type of event to happen to many type of Western organizations, and it can have a really significant impact if that happens. So to round this off, I would encourage you to realize that APTeens pose a significant risk, even despite all of the takedowns, all of the arrests, right? We've seen a lot of buzz around these guys. Realize that they are actively being sought out as partners from Russian cybercrime groups who leverage their ability to gain initial access as a strong point. Acknowledge that they're also targeting you as an individual, as a first responder, as legal counsel, as an executive, and not just you as an enterprise, and have them top of mind when it comes to defense and enterprise awareness. Thank you very much. I hope it was educational, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you very much. We are pushed for time. Brilliant presentation. Again, a little bit frightening. Now, 2 quick questions I think we've got time for. You've been looking into Scattered Spider. There's been a lot of talk about them. At the dark web reconnaissance group that you're leading, what do you think? How big is it, and is it growing?
Scattered Spider as a group is, at any given moment, it's probably something like 7 to 15 core members, right. But they are part of a wider ecosystem, and there is a revolving door between other groups.
Okay. One quick question that's going to come in, and I know it, but I thought it'd be a nice one to finish. What did you do as a teenager then? How did you stay out of this mess?
I played a lot of World of Warcraft.
Excellent. That's great. I think you've got a few fans in the World of Warcraft phase. Look, that was an excellent presentation. I know you were around. So, Manny, welcome once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.